Please sit down. We'll close the doors. Can somebody near the doors close them? Thank you. I will take a break for this session, and the wonderful Rana Forohar will chair. I'll leave you in her hands. Please sit down. We are starting.
Okay, thanks, Christina. I'm going to give everybody about 1 more minute to take their seats, and then we're going to get started so we can stay on schedule. So grab a seat, grab your drinks, and we'll start. So my name is Rana Forohar. I'm the global business columnist and associate editor at the FT. I've written a number of books, Makers and Takers, Don't Be Evil, Homecoming, that really at core deal with concentration of power in finance, in tech, in the political economy. And so I'm very pleased to be here moderating this awesome panel on industrial policy. I'm just going to very, very quickly give a line about our speakers, and then we're going to jump right into it. We've got Nathan Lane, who's a professor at Oxford. We have René Rapassi, who is a member of the European Parliament. And we have Ufuk Ajitse, sorry, who I'm going to get your name not quite right, who is a professor at the University of Chicago. We're also going to have my good friend, Heather Boucher, who's remote. And you look like you're right here, but you look a lot more comfortable. So there you go, who is a member of the Council on Economic Advisors and really one of the chief architects of the Inflation Reduction Act. So let me just start, and I'm going to crack the whip now. Take a seat. Shush to all of you, and we're going to get started, okay? Industrial policy, I've been doing my job covering economics and business globally for 33 years now for my sins, and I can say that there was a point not so long ago where you really, particularly in the US, you just couldn't say the words industrial policy. I mean, they were really third rail. Now, as somebody that grew up in the rural Midwest and had a father that worked in the manufacturing industry, started and struggled running in small and mid-sized businesses in the auto supply chain, dealt with monopoly issues all the time, dealt with all of what we would call, or what, efficiency economists might call negative externalities of things, which is basically what business in the real world deals with all the time. And I think that this is a conversation that we're now having post-financial crisis, post-pandemic, post-war in Ukraine, post-commodities volatility. We're all just having this very felt experience of, gosh, markets are not always working the way they're supposed to. And in fact, we've just had some great academics and practitioners, and we will have more telling us how and why that's always been the case. I think what's really, really new, and Heather and I have had many conversations about this, is how market externalities are where the action is. The market really hasn't dealt with climate in the last 40 years. The market certainly has not dealt with inequality. These issues are what are shaping politics and economic growth figures right now, so we have to deal with them. So industrial policy is really back on the scene, but there are all kinds of industrial policies, as we know. There's the Danish industrial policy. There's the Chinese industrial policy. There's, bad national champions industrial policy that many of us in Europe have seen and dealt with. And in the US, there's sort of a new awakening just to the whole idea of industrial policy. And it's funny that policymakers actually in the US even say industrial strategy, because I think they're still a little bit uncomfortable getting behind this idea. And there have also been a lot of question marks, I think understandable question marks from outside the US of well, what is industrial policy in the US? How is this going to work out? What are these subsidies? How should Europe respond? How do we deal, frankly, with the fact that most of the rising economic actors are state players and they simply don't deal, by the letter of the law of the WTO and never did? So, all right, all that is in play. So that's a bit of scene setting for us. So the goal of this panel is to say, what are the best practices here? How can antitrust be an important shaper of those best practices? and where are we going in terms of doing some market craft and statecraft that puts us in a better place where it's not just growth at all costs, but growth that is sustainable, growth that is inclusive, creating a fair marketplace. So with that, Nathan, over to you. I'm gonna ask you to set the stage because you've done some research on best practices, and if you could maybe talk a little bit about new industrial strategy, what you're seeing, and basically what people should be thinking of when they hear the term.
Yeah, so there's been something called the new economics of industrial policy. And this thing really emerged because industrial policy was kind of abandoned by economics. I mean, there was a consensus around industrial policy, but that consensus was really a matter of faith. It wasn't a consensus that was based on empirics. It wasn't a consensus, it was maybe based on some good principles. But as the world started changing, we, as economists, were relatively flat-footed insofar as kind of saying coherent things about what's happening in the world around us. And so what new economics of industrial policy is doing is saying, hey, let's take the tools of applied economics and take industrial policy seriously as an object of inquiry. Let's take this seriously. Let's actually take this empirically seriously, decompose it, and figure out what's going on. And so what we found is that a lot of this simple kind of binaries and these platitudes that we kind of reflexively omit as economists are wholly inadequate. That when you dig deep, when you kind of unpack what's going on empirically, the world is way much more complex and way much more subtle than kind of our knee-jerk reactions accommodate as economists. And so that's to say, best practice is still emerging. And one thing we find too, insofar as lessons, is that we don't even have basics out there. There's a huge mismatch between the amount of people who, I could probably count the number of people who study industrial policy, I could probably count on my two hands, like who study it seriously within mainstream economics. But when we think of industrial policy practice out there, it's been ubiquitous and growing since essentially 2009. And so we do not yet have a literature on best practice. But as we unpack, well, pretty good episodes and kind of like nuanced episodes have happened in the past, some things do emerge. That is, success stories in industrial policy, those that we see and observe, are success stories where designers have been really mindful of the political and state capacity constraints of implementation. They've been very, very concerned with this stuff. They've been concerned with efficiency. They've been concerned with preserving competition. They've been concerned with many of the things people in this audience are very much concerned with. And I think there's a lot of synergies potentially between us as industrial policy economists and, of course, what people are doing in this room. In particular, when it comes to designing and doing this stuff properly and deploying the right institutions. Yeah.
Okay, we'll stop there. I'm going to come back to some of these topics, but Phuc, I want to have you jump in and talk a little bit about your work, your book, and in particular the idea of how industrial policy can actually power growth. You know, oftentimes in the past couple of decades, we've thought of those things in two separate baskets. Industrial policies over here, it's about state overhang, it's bad national champions. But, you know, the market knows best approach has actually led to stagnation, more volatility, particularly problems with consumption when you've got the, 90-10 divide in a consumer society. So talk a little bit about how we can think about industrial policy as a growth driver in the North, but also in the global South, and if there are really any lessons from South to North to be taken, particularly with, Asian tigers, some of the examples that you might cite.
Thank you very much. It's great to be part of this wonderful conference. I think there's definitely, one thing that's for sure is that there's no one-size-fits-all industrial policy. And every country, somehow they have, broken parts, and every country has its own peculiarity. It has its own strength and also own deficiencies. That's why I think it is extremely important to understand first the chemistry and the details of a country. And that's why I think microdata, understanding microdata, doing the proper X-ray and MRIs for each economy and putting the right diagnostics is extremely important. Now, of course, as I mentioned, every country has its unique properties, but if I were to generalize it, I can at least order countries in terms of their distance to the technology frontier. If they are far from frontier, then there is a lot for them to learn from the frontier. So they don't need to rediscover the things from scratch. I mean, I'm not the first one to say this. Gershon Kron made this argument in his 1962 book, Advantage of Backwardness. We know that openness and FDI and openness to talent migration works, and we have a lot of examples of that. But when we come to the frontier, then I think we are not having a very good understanding of what's happening at the frontier. Indeed, now we are after new technologies that don't exist. We need to discover new things that don't exist. How do we do it? We need creativity. But creativity requires talent. Talent requires training. Human capital is the number one thing that we need to prioritize. But most of the time, when it comes to industrial policy and trying to generate growth through industrial policy, we are debating about how to subsidize firms. And it's really the second order item in this list to discuss human capital, strength of the talent pool. I mean, it's very clear. If you don't have good players, you cannot win the championship. Now, can we learn from the history? I think we can by looking at the bad mistakes. So, of course, there has been a lot of arguments also in the first session, and now the literature is just growing extremely loud and clear that market concentration and market power is a major issue. So let's go back in history. Of course, 1981 was, Economic Recovery Act. First time R&D tax credit was introduced in 1981, and then Minnesota was the first state to introduce at the state level too. There has been enormous, first temporary, now it became permanent, subsidy for R&D. Now, why do we do this? Because we want R&D to go up, and when R&D goes up, innovation will go up, and we will generate economic growth. Did R&D go up afterwards? Yes, when we look at the NSF numbers, R&D to GDP ratio was about 2%. Now it's about 3.5%. Massive increase in R&D spending. What we get in return? If anything, we got productivity slowdown. We got market concentration in return. So that's why I think now we should really stop looking at the aggregate numbers, and we should stop worrying about the composition of those numbers. Who is investing in R&D? What do they do it? Because we know extremely well from the economics literature that different firms have different incentives to innovate and to push the frontier forward. If I'm a new player in the market, of course, I will do everything to prove myself. I mean, when I was an assistant professor, I wasn't sleeping, right? I needed to prove myself. But when firms start to dominate the market, right, when they are capturing the market, they can change their incentives, right? Especially for firms, rather than pushing the frontier, now they can start becoming defensive. Do we have evidence for that? Well, recently, indeed this year, we published a paper looking at the Italian firms. And in Italy, it was very visible. As firms are becoming the dominant market leader, their innovation intensity is just going down. Guess what's going up? The number of politicians that they hire relative to their size is going up. Number of local politicians is increasing intensely. Why do they do it? I mean, this is what we call the leadership paradox. Or look at the patent data. When you look at the patent quality of the firms, the patent quality the patents that they produce early on in their life is much higher quality than later patents that they are producing. They're also super active in the secondary market. So, in 1980s, 30% of the patents were being bought by the largest 1% of the firms. Today, that number went up to 65%. Why do they buy all these patents? Are they necessarily going to put them into use? Probably not. So let's look at, when we look just at the R&D numbers or patent numbers, I don't really know what to make out of that, right? So,
I want to pick up on this point because you're landing on something really important here, and it's important in the current, frankly, geopolitical national security debate around national champions. There's a big argument in tech and in particularly in AI that you've got to be big to compete with China. China's top down, it's all about big. But you're saying something which is totally true. Everybody in business knows it. Innovation comes from the bottom up. It tends to come from individual academics and small firms. So perhaps we want to encourage that.
Exactly. So you're touching upon an extremely important issue. And this is, where I want to talk about business dynamism. Since 1980, we have so many indicators showing that the business dynamism in the United States, which is really the main engine of economic growth, is declining. Recently, we published a paper that describes 10 different indicators. We just wanted to limit at 10, just to make it a round number, but there are more than 10 indicators showing that the dynamism is declining. Entry rate, number of new businesses relative to incumbents, it used to be about 15%, now it's down to 7%. Dynamism doesn't have to necessarily come from new entrants, because look at the German case, for instance. Germany has lived through its incumbents. But when you look at the incumbent dynamism in the United States, which is measured by job reallocation rate, job creation and job destruction rate, because productive incumbents should be expanding and the unproductive ones should be shrinking. So as a result, this factor reallocation among firms should be an important indicator for us. Job reallocation rate has been tanking significantly. Markups, obviously, Jan has done amazing work on this with his co-authors. Markups are increasing, market power is increasing. On the flip side, labor share is decreasing. So what we are seeing is more and more dynamism declining. Now, as I mentioned, human capital is an important part of it. So then we should ask ourselves, okay, R&D is something, but what about the inventors who are really producing patents? People who are working, not necessarily owning the patents, but producing it. In the United States, number of inventors relative to the population has more than doubled since 2000, more than doubled. And this is a period where we are seeing even a stronger slowdown in productivity. And when we look at the distribution of inventors among incumbents versus young firms, a massive shift, more than 50% shift towards large incumbents just after 2000. Another important problem is that inventors, they can also form their own startups. And typically when we look at the life cycle of firms, those firms that are founded by inventors, it has a much steeper life cycle profile, because probably inventors know best how to put their idea into action. But now what's happening is that these inventors are trying to look for jobs in large corporations rather than executing their ideas. So as a result, entrepreneurship among inventors is also tanking very significantly.
So you're giving all kinds of great data, which I hope people will follow up on. But the key point here to me is that if industrial strategy or policy for any country has to be about inclusive growth, we've got an issue when innovation coming from individual entrepreneurs is being squashed by concentration. And that's the intersection of those two things, the industrial policy and competition. I want to move on to Heather. And Heather, I just have to introduce you by giving a wonderful little anecdote that you gave me in a Washington Monthly piece that I did recently called The Great Reordering, which is about Bidenomics, and we're going to talk about later on a different panel. But you said something I think really quite salient for this discussion. You were talking about you'd been in and out of government, you were not in the administration at the time, but were thinking about whether you were going to join, and that you were looking at the way in which the Biden folks were going to deal with climate change in particular, and you asked about carbon pricing, and they said, well, we're not thinking about carbon pricing as the way of dealing with climate. We're thinking about climate the way we would about war. This is a national emergency, and the markets have had 40 years to deal with it, and they didn't. And you said that that was like a wow moment for you. So I'd love it maybe if you can kind of jump in and follow up on, now that you are in the White House, how has that thinking gone? Where has that thinking gone? And how can particularly people outside Washington understand what this administration is doing that's so different?
Thank you, Rana. And this has been just a great conversation so far. I'm so happy to be able to be here, and to Christina for putting this all together. So I want to start with something that you said in your opening remarks about how we like to talk about industrial strategy, not industrial policy, and explain that a little bit, because I think that gets to the same set of issues, which is that we see this not as one magic bullet, one specific policy, but that this is about thinking about what we make in the United States and how we make it, which is really the founding set of questions that have motivated what the president now calls Bidenomics, but our middle-out economic strategy. and thinking about what industries are important for American national security, economic competitiveness, good jobs across the country. How is the economy performing for people? That is the first question. And the second is, how are we getting to those sets of economic outcomes? How do we do that? And there are two key pillars. One is that we're focusing on empowering and educating workers, and in fact, comments on that are so on point, and happy to talk about that as the conversation goes on. But I want to go to that third pillar, which is that we need to make sure that markets are fair and open and competitive. And so we believe that the how we have the industries and the kinds of businesses that can thrive in the United States depends on finding that balance between empowering, educating workers, making sure that markets are structured to be fair and competitive. So in that way, our industrial strategy, our competition policy, and our trade policy are all working together towards these common goals. And I think that, for me, in the anecdote that you just noted, was really an aha moment as I was getting, as I was starting to work on the campaign and talking to people about, what the thinking was. This was early in 2020, and we were mostly obsessed with dealing with COVID and all of those challenges. But we started to unpack how Joe Biden, now the president, was thinking about these questions. You could see that he was pulling it all together and understanding that, as you said in the opening, you have to deal with the negative externalities that our economy has created and find ways to bring those into your economic thinking in new and different ways. So let me just say a couple of things on how we're thinking about this response and how these three prongs of industrial strategy, competition policy, and trade policy go together. I'm going to give some top lines, and hopefully we can dig into a few of these as the conversation goes on. But first, our industrial strategy is about making smart public investments in specific industries that are going to enhance our domestic capacity and capabilities. There is always a focus on making sure that those investments are being driven towards places and that have been too often left behind, that we are paying attention to equity and to small businesses. We're very proud of the fact that the past 3 years in the United States have been the three biggest years for small business applications of the kinds of businesses that are likely to lead to employees. So there's been a real intentionality around there. And so the president worked with Congress to pass the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. That is his Investing in America agenda. And these investments are meant to mobilize the private sector, to crowd in private capital into industries like semiconductors and clean energy. And we've already seen $640 billion in announced investments to date. If I was showing you my long, my big slide deck of economist slides, I would show you the slides on how investment in the construction of manufacturing facilities is literally off the charts. So we have seen the private sector stepping up. And that gets to the second plank, which is that our competition policy, and the president has a whole of government competition agenda that allows our industrial strategy to invest in creating strong industries rather than strong companies or national champions. We are not focused on picking winners and losers, but we're focused on what sectors do we need. How can we make sure that those sectors are both competitive and can thrive? And so we're focused on picking out industries and shaping those markets to be pro-competitive while also making sure that we're setting them up to the extent possible for success in the near term. 3 examples that I just want to get top lines on that we could dig into: the Inflation Reduction Act, the investment in production tax credits are open to any project that produces electricity with zero greenhouse gas emissions. We're not deciding which technologies. We're saying, hey, if you do this, you can get these tax credits. In the bipartisan infrastructure law, and something I'm personally so excited about because it really does connect the dots on these issues, federally funded electric vehicle chargers have to use a common standard for their plugs. And there's been a lot of work across government, and actually we just wrote a blog about this in December, making sure that we're setting up that sector to be competitive, but that there's interoperability across different standards, right? So that new entrants can easily enter the market. Okay, great. And then the third example, also something that I'm very excited about. Last year, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, what we call OIRA, for the first time ever, released guidance to federal agencies on how to consider competition effects of rules and regulations on top of cost-benefit analysis. And that is a future-leaning policy. We're going to be applying that to future rules to ensure that competition is considered across rulemaking. So we've been thinking about competition in our subsidies and our spending. We've been thinking about how we execute on standards, and we've been thinking about it in how we do the very work of the regulatory state in regulatory and rulemaking. Finally, briefly, our trade policy has been focused on ensuring that domestic industries are operating in a fair, competitive global landscape. One thing in the president's executive order on competition, again, this whole of government competition agenda, it included language, and I want to just quote here to be specific, that the United States faces new challenges in its economic standing in the world, including unfair competitive pressures from foreign monopolies and firms that are state-owned or state-sponsored, or whose market power is directly supported by foreign governments. That we need to be thinking about the international order from a competition lens, from an antitrust lens, and make sure that we are supporting that resiliency of supply chains, but that we are also making sure that we are doing what we can to foster that competitive landscape. And so I just want to stress that, whenever I'm in an international audience, the U.S. is not striving for autarky. We are really focused on how we can engage in a global trade landscape that recognizes the challenges of monopolies and also recognizes, and I will end here, that on the point of climate change, because that's who started the question. One of the things, and we released a couple of briefs on this in the fall, the challenge of climate change requires that we invent and bring to commercial scale as quickly as possible a series of new technologies in clean energy that are beyond the capacity of any one country, beyond the capacity of even the United States, in ways that require that we partner globally, and that there is so much opportunity for countries to become part of this new global supply chain on clean energy. And so I will leave there with that optimistic point, but that we do need to make sure that we are ensuring fair competition here in the United States and with our trading partners.
Okay, awesome scene setting, and you've also really set the table for USTR Ty, who's going to be talking a little bit about U.S. trade policy and building on all that, which is very much about building supply chains with allies, post-colonial paradigm. Let me just amplify, before I move to Renee and really get the European perspective in here, I want to amplify a couple things that you just said. Interoperability, creating a playing field. If you look back in history, there is really good research to show that you get big shared bursts of productive growth. Like that creates a middle class, not just financial speculation. When the government sets a floor on standards, creates interoperability, and then kind of lets the private sector on an even playing field go to town. That's what happened with laying down of the railroads, investment into early internet tech by the government, et cetera. So I think that's a great point. I think also this idea of the pandemic resilience. I mean, did anybody not just in the US, but anywhere, think it was a good idea to have 92% of all high-end semiconductors in Taiwan? I mean, like, really? In one, very geopolitically contentious place? I think the idea of knitting together, it doesn't matter whether it's the big state, big tech, big pharma, it's about big, and it's about making sure that all players in all countries have an equal chance. Renee, let me bring you in, because you will provide the much-needed European perspective here. Hearing all this, and particularly hearing what Heather just said about the U.S. approach, what do you hear that you like? How does this differ from where Europe is going, or where you think Europe should be going?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this exciting conference and the exchanges that we have. I think this is very timely and very necessary. To start with, how Europe differs from the American debate, its industrial policy is no ugly word. On the contrary, it's used by many and quite inflationary, as a consequence that we have difficulties to give shape to it. Second is, we are going to have elections on 9th of June, and afterwards we're going to have a new commission. And everybody's wondering what's going to be the headline of this new commission. I'm certain it's not going to be the next Green Deal. I'm quite sure that the headline is going to be competitiveness. maybe with the addendum on completing the internal market, based on the two reports that we're going to get by Draghi and by Letta. And then the question is, what is meant by this? Now, there is a group who defines industrial policy as, you call it, I think, a bit the national champion trap, as a nice word to roll back achievements that we have in Europe of the last 10 years, by basically claiming we get in competitiveness under the heading of industrial policy by relieving companies from regulatory burden and bureaucracy, whatever that means in detail. Ultimately, it just means get rid of the Green Deal and get rid of the advancements of the last 10 years. That's going to happen if there is no other vision on industrial policy. The other vision that we currently see rather predominant is a rather traditional one, let's say in the French 1970s tradition, meaning I open the money bag and then everybody who wants gets some money and something will come out of it. And besides, I'm having nice regulations with beautiful numbers and some year dates in the very, very far future. And because I'm putting this in there, I'm going to realize this. One could even exaggerate and say it's kind of a Soviet style of industrial policy. History has shown it's not very successful. So from that point of view, we need a third way. Now then we are back to the 90s, so let's leave out that one. But we need a different understanding of industrial policy. I believe there has to be a progressive understanding of what is industrial policy. And here I saw now in this debate a lot of elements that have to nourish into this debate. I believe, let's say, first of all, industrial policy is for me the state intervening into free markets mechanisms. That is a very broad notion in that sense. That shows, we realize that markets are obviously not able to deliver on a multitude of public interests. Not surprising, because market operators are following private interests. And if they do not align, it's no surprise that they are not getting there. So what is there to be done? If we take now an antitrust perspective, I think this gives an idea what has to be done. Antitrust in all this in the European context looks at state aid, and state aid basically saying, okay, do I give state aid into one direction or the other direction? Once again, simply opening the money bag doesn't bring any added value. Moreover, competition policy, if it's then looking at how markets work, is here obsessed with this efficiency paradigm. And once when it looks at market concentrations, have a proof of abuse before tackling market concentration. So going against market concentration, breaking it up in order to come to innovation that is much needed, that is the first step. So therefore, I do think that the basis for the recipe is given by the interventions that were just made. It's innovation that we need, it's R&D that we need. If we look at digital markets that we actually should not call markets because they are no markets, what we need in order to break them up is, next to a good competition policy, obviously, the next competitor, the next challenger. The next challenger is probably already born, hopefully working already at the university. But what is nowadays happening is, if this idea ever becomes into a challenger, this challenger is killed the instant Google, Apple, or the others see them, killer acquisitions. So therefore, protecting startup ideas to let them grow in support by market authorities, I believe this is one of the issues. But if you go even one step further, and then we look at the bigger picture here. When I was an assistant professor, I also didn't sleep much. I was in academia until February 22. So, and the reason was not my newly born kids. It was not even the fact that I had to grade a lot of exams or to do the management part. The reason that I couldn't sleep was that I had to write tons and tons of funding applications that were all unsuccessful. So if the idea of market management is setting up a lot of public funds that require programming of research and development, where researchers have to draft proposals by saying, I'm going to invent something in 10 years and I do it in this way, nothing of that is groundbreaking, because obviously we don't know what is going to be groundbreaking in 10 years, it's not going to work. We have a neoliberal university that is putting everything on the top but research. So we need to have a change of mindset that unleashes the powers of research and innovation at our public institutions, at our universities, give the space to researchers to probably research, and afterwards transform ideas into their ability to be on markets, and then competition policy has to protect the new competitor to grow. So that is, I think, a way how that can go forward. That is one example, but it gives the ideas how progressive industrial policy should look like, and how, as Europe, where we don't have the same fiscal capacities as the United States. We never can keep up with the US or others in terms of fiscal capacities, but we have other means. And these are the basic ideas of a progressive industrial policy for the next 5 years.
Okay, I love, yay, clap, okay, clap moment. I love how aggressive you're being. Nathan, you were did you want to jump in there? Were you trying to make were you waving at me or no?
No.
To make a point, okay.
No, it's fine.
Okay, so we've only got about 10 minutes. I want to focus on this idea of I hate using the term human capital because I feel like that's a, very financialized term, but human potential, human value, the humanism in technology. Doha, in the last panel, made, I think, an extremely good point that the FTC is recognizing, frankly, the natural monopoly potential of many platform technologies and the way in which it is now looping in AI. You have to get ahead of these things. You can't wait necessarily for remedies after. At that point, it's too late. I mean, anybody that's ever read Information Rules by Hal Varian should, kind of know this. But let's think about where we are now with monopoly power, with concentration, and particularly with AI and platform tech. What should we be thinking about? What are the levers in industrial policy, in antitrust, that we should be thinking about pulling? We'll just go down the line very quickly here. Nathan, you can start.
So what are the levers for regulating AI within the framework of industrial policy? It's completely, I'm going to do something here. This isn't my area of expertise.
It's okay,
It's
you can swim outside your lane, but all the good ideas are coming when we swim outside our lanes.
Sure. Completely fair. It's way outside of my area of expertise, so yeah.
There's only 8 minutes. You can't do too much harm. Go ahead.
So I would like to expand a little bit more on the human capital side of things. I think it really matters where the same individual is working, whether it's working for a small startup company or whether it's working for a large incumbent. And when we look at the data, especially in the US, when we look at the job-to-job transitions of the same inventor, when the inventor moves to a large incumbent as opposed to a small firm, the wage increase is incredible. So there's a very strong wage increase, but he's not being or she's not being rewarded for being more productive. Indeed, when we look at the productivity of the same inventor, productivity goes down. So that's why I think first we have to recognize that whenever we do these industrial policies, is it really the case that we are touching the small and young entrepreneurs, or are we, supporting the firms that have army of lawyers, for instance? So I think this is an extremely important issue. And the second thing I wanted to highlight, which you also mentioned earlier, I think we should always keep in mind the Schumpeterian dynamics, pumping fresh blood into the economy. But the small businesses and small and young businesses has been shrinking for a long time, and the recent events, especially the pandemic, didn't help small businesses. The registry numbers were record high, absolutely, but until the rise of inflation and the interest rate. And when we look at the employment share, and small businesses are very fragile, we should not forget them. It's just like our children in the family. They are our future, right? But they are also very fragile. So that's why we need to keep a close eye on them using near real-time data. And when we look at the real-time data, indeed, small business employment was rising until the rise of inflation and the interest rate. And since then, small business employment share has been declining. And what's happening is that when you look at the way they are financing their business, now because they have very difficulty accessing capital, they are using their credit cards to finance their business. The use of credit card has increased since the pandemic. It has increased by 20% among small businesses. And here, these are businesses that have at most 9 workers. So we partnered with the Intuit QuickBooks and trying to monitor these businesses near real time. And I think this is worrying. And as you said, these are the tomorrow's potential superstars. But in order to maintain and preserve tomorrow's superstars, we shouldn't be short-sighted, and we should be careful about the small and young businesses today.
Okay, Heather, I want to give you about 3 minutes to jump in on this. And in particular, if there's anything else to amplify about the President's EO in 2021, and this idea of really moving from consumer to citizen, which I find kind of fascinating.
Well, I'm glad that that's where you are leaving off on the question, because I've been really thinking, and as I've been listening to these remarks, and Renee's point particularly about investment in R&D and sort of that we need to focus on innovation. I think one of the things we have really focused on in the Biden administration is making sure that that innovation actually benefits, in our case, the American people. So, making that connection between how are we using the public purse to support business startups, to support innovation, to support researchers and the writing, and their work at universities. But then how is that new technology, those new innovations actually benefiting the economy writ large? How is that a part of a larger middle-out strategy is a really important piece of the connective tissue. Then because economists, we often assume, oh, these good ideas get out there, then the best idea will commercialize at scale, and then everyone will benefit, there'll be these great jobs created. And what we've seen is that too often that just isn't the case. So making sure that we are very much connecting those dots has been an important part of the president's agenda. So that is one piece of it. And then, and that comes through in making sure that as we are making investments into new technologies, are we encouraging investments in things that are going to be, very important industries, ones that are going to be driving that new technology? Again, that's why we're focused on cutting edge in semiconductors, cutting edge in clean energy, but also making sure that those benefits accrue to U.S. workers through making sure that those industries create jobs for not just the elite at universities, but create jobs for people all across the country is an important piece of that puzzle. And then just briefly on the platform question, so I was also really glad you asked that. In last year's economic report of the president, we actually have a whole chapter on the economics of platforms and the two-sided nature of those markets, and really sort of digging into a series of regulation questions around what it means to have these very large monopolies, how we can foster more open competition, but also what it means in terms of data privacy and what it means for consumers. And I think that the thread between these two sides of this answer that I'm giving is that with everything that we're doing with the competition agenda, we are trying to make sure that we are not just focused on what this means for low prices for consumers. Certainly, that is one of the benefits of competition, well established, super important. But we need to make sure that it also benefits workers and their families through what it means for labor markets, what it means for opportunities for small businesses. And for too long, that hasn't been an important part of our competition agenda. So I will end there. I feel like that's probably more than 3 minutes.
No.
Such a rich conversation that we need to keep happening.
This is great, and we will keep having it. And I love this idea of a more holistic view of the economy, not just consumption. Renee, I'm going to give you the last word, the last 2.5 minutes. I'll just quickly tee you up and say, when I was at the last time we did this conference, I came away feeling like, wow, Europe is not where we'd hoped it would be on competition and the energies. But I have to say, I hear in your voice a lot of energy. Where will we be in the next couple of years in Europe? Where do we need to go? What needs to happen?
Well, I'm sitting here as a member of the European Parliament representing the Socialist and Democratic Group. We are going to have now in the next panel Franziska Brandner from the Green Party in Germany, and we have some liberal thinking in the same direction. The majority situation after 9 of June currently doesn't look like we will have the majority. Nevertheless, because the intellectual argument is clear, and therefore it is so important that we have these dialogues, since I think academia is further advanced than maybe the potential conservative majority in the future, we have to hammer in that if we want to act in the European interest, and not increase our debt burdens by having a lot of sunk investments, that we must pursue precisely the way that we have currently designed. I believe we get a great chance with the publication of Draghi and Letta report in March that is going to open the debate for Europe. And that is a debate that we need to have until the 9th of June so that it's part of the election campaign, to make clear that these are the points by which we as Europe can bring in our competitive advantage. And our competitive advantage is not copy-pasting the Inflation Reduction Act. It's somewhere else in the outlines that I have just mentioned. And so my main interest also here in this conference, because we have this big audience, is indeed to advertise these ideas that I have just presented, which are outlines, and to work further on it, and by that making these ideas more popular. So in that sense that we can enter it in the DMA, in the DSA, in the ideas that were put forward by the Commission on reforming the merger regulation, on cases pending at the European Court of Justice. We have bits and pieces that are going precisely in this direction. We must just make use of this and say that industrial policy is a progressive idea how we can make markets work.
Great place to end. Thank you all for a terrific panel and all your great ideas and energy.